The first thing I heard wasn't birds. It was concrete pouring into my grandfather's lake. Imagine inheriting untouched wilderness, and finding a stranger charging people $500 to swim in it. That's where my story begins. My name is Bryson McCall, and 3 months ago, I was an Army logistics coordinator trying to figure out civilian life after 8 years in places where maps lied and roads disappeared. I thought the hardest thing I'd face was silence. I was wrong. Because the moment I crossed the property line of my great-uncle Hank's land, the air changed. Pine sap and lake mist should have filled my lungs. Instead, diesel exhaust. Wet cement. Chainsaws screaming like they were angry at the trees themselves. I parked my truck and just stood there. Frozen. Crystal Lake, my lake, was scarred by tire tracks. Heavy machinery sat where deer used to drink at sunrise. And on the far shoreline, rising like a concrete insult, was a mansion that absolutely did not belong there. $2.8 million worth of entitlement. Infinity pool. Private dock. Helicopter pad carved into land Hank protected with his life. Here's the part that made my hands shake. People were swimming. Laughing. Drinking champagne. A hand-painted sign read, "Private lake access, $500 per guest." I inherited 1,700 acres of protected Montana wilderness. And someone else was monetizing it. Hank wasn't just my great-uncle. He was a legend. Bought this land in 1987 using a VA loan and a middle finger to civilization. Lived in a 1940s fishing lodge. Fed deer by hand every morning at exactly 6 a.m. The family thought he was crazy. Turns out, he was right about everything. His will came with 2 instructions. Keep it wild. Keep it free. Standing there, listening to bulldozers tear into his shoreline, I knew I was already failing him. I grabbed binoculars, old habit, and scanned the scene. Workers were using my boat launch to ferry concrete and steel across the lake. Trespassing. Polluting protected wetlands. Every instinct I had screamed logistics failure. So I did what Hank would have done. I walked over. The site foreman, Pete, looked like a man who'd rather fistfight a bear than explain himself. When I told him who I was, the color drained from his face. "You're Henry's kin," he muttered, eyes darting toward the mansion. "Lady didn't mention no family." That's when she appeared. Vivian Sterling Hayes. 52. Impeccable. Designer hiking boots that had never touched dirt. She stepped out of a pristine Range Rover like the land itself owed her an apology. "You must be Henry's nephew," she said, skipping the handshake. "Such a shame how he let all this rot." I told her workers were trespassing. I told her the lake was protected. I told her she was standing on my land. She laughed. Then she rolled out a brand new survey across her car hood. "Oh, sweetie," she said, tapping the paper with a manicured nail. "You're mistaken. This shows the boat launch is mine. Had it done 6 months ago. Poor Henry was confused in his final years." I knew that survey was fake. Hank taught me every boundary marker when I was 12. He taught me to read land the way other kids learned video games. But Vivian wasn't done. She leaned in and smiled like a shark that already smelled blood. "I've already filed a harassment complaint," she said casually. "Sheriff Peterson and I play tennis. He's very concerned about unstable veterans bothering respectable residents." Standing there, tasting humiliation as bitter as burnt coffee, I realized something chilling. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a takeover. And she thought I'd roll over. She had no idea how expensive that mistake would become. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared, but because every instinct I'd sharpened in the Army was screaming this was a coordinated operation. At 2:17 a.m., I was sitting at Hank's old kitchen table, the same one he carved himself, surrounded by maps, deeds, and dusty folders that smelled like pine and thyme. The mansion lights across the lake burned all night. Music echoed. Champagne laughter floated over water Hank once called holy. That contrast lit something dangerous in me. Here's what Vivian didn't understand: logistics isn't about muscle. It's about paper, timing, and pressure. And she'd already made her first mistake by assuming Hank was senile. He wasn't. Hank documented everything. Every boundary stake. Every easement. Every environmental protection clause tied to Crystal Lake. By sunrise I found it, a handwritten note taped inside an old survey tube. If anyone ever claims the lake, check subsection 14b. Trust the water, not the suits. That line hit me harder than any mortar blast. Subsection 14b wasn't just a footnote. It was a legal landmine. The lake wasn't just private property. It was a protected watershed governed by conservation covenants that outranked county surveys. Any commercial activity required unanimous landholder consent, which meant Vivian's $500 swim parties. Illegal. Her dock extension? Illegal. Her helicopter pad? Catastrophically illegal. But here's the problem. None of that mattered if she controlled local enforcement. By noon, the pressure started. My phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. McCall, a calm voice said. This is Sheriff Peterson. We've received multiple complaints about your aggressive behavior at a construction site. Aggressive? For standing on my own land. He suggested, politely, that I avoid further disturbances while the county reviewed boundary disputes. Translation: stand down or we make this messy. Then came the second call. My bank. A routine hold had been placed on Hank's estate accounts pending verification. No timeline. No urgency. Just a quiet financial chokehold. That's when it clicked. Vivian wasn't just building a mansion. She was racing a clock. Construction crews don't move like that unless someone's burning cash fast. Helicopter pads don't appear overnight unless investors are already promised returns. And nobody charges $500 a head unless they're desperate to recoup before something blows up. So I followed the money. Public records. Corporate filings. Shell LLCs stacked like Russian dolls. And there it was. Sterling Wellness Resorts. A luxury. Eco-retreat. Brand hemorrhaging money after a pharmaceutical divorce settlement gutted its capital. Vivian wasn't building a home. She was building a proof of concept. If she could show Crystal Lake as a functioning high-end destination, she could flip the entire project to foreign investors before regulators caught on. Which meant one thing. I wasn't an inconvenience. I was the last obstacle. That night, my truck tires were slashed. Clean. Professional. A warning, not vandalism. The next morning, a temporary fence appeared, blocking my own access road. County logos slapped on crooked. And taped to my cabin door? A bright orange notice. Notice of environmental violation, immediate compliance required. The irony nearly made me laugh. They were accusing me of contaminating the lake while pouring concrete into it. But buried at the bottom of that notice was the real message. A hearing date. 2 weeks away. If I missed it? Default judgment. That's when I stopped reacting and started planning. Because Vivian thought this was about land. She had no idea she just declared war with someone trained to win them on spreadsheets, supply chains, and patience. And the next move? Would cost her far more than money. The hearing clock changed everything. 2 weeks sounds generous, until you realize county hearings are designed to exhaust people, not reveal truth. Paper delays. Rescheduled calls. Missing documents. A slow bleed meant to make normal folks quit. Vivian was betting I'd fold. Instead, I treated it like a deployment. Day 1, I drove 6 hours to Helena before dawn. No calls. No warnings. I walked straight into the State Department of Environmental Quality with a folder so thick the clerk raised an eyebrow. Inside it, Hank's original conservation filings, water purity tests dating back 3 decades, wildlife migration maps, and something even more dangerous, correspondence. Hank had been fighting this exact threat for years. Developers had sniffed around Crystal Lake before. Each time, Hank responded the same way, silence, followed by paperwork so lethal it scared them off. He didn't argue. He documented. One email from 2011 made my hands shake. Any commercial exploitation of Crystal Lake will trigger automatic federal review under the Clean Water Act due to its classification as a cold water heritage ecosystem. Federal. That meant Vivian's county connections were meaningless. But there was a catch. Federal agencies move slow, unless they smell public exposure. So I built pressure from another angle. Back at the lake, I started documenting everything. Drone footage of sediment plumes clouding the shoreline. Time-stamped videos of workers dumping runoff into protected wetlands. Audio recordings of generators running before permitted hours. Then I noticed something strange. Every afternoon at exactly 4:30, the construction crews stopped, and luxury SUVs arrived. Guests. Vivian was already operating. I watched from the tree line as people in designer swimwear stepped onto the illegal dock, champagne in hand, laughing as if the lake were a private spa. Someone had hung a sign near the water. Sterling Crystal Experience, $500 per guest. That sign was my opening. I printed flyers. Simple. Clean. Non-confrontational. This lake is federally protected. Commercial use may expose guests to liability. Documentation available upon request. I placed them on windshields. On the dock railing. Near the parking turnout. No yelling. No threats. Just information. Within an hour, the mood changed. Laughter faded. Phones came out. A woman in white linen heels stormed back to her SUV, face tight with panic. One man demanded a refund loud enough for half the shoreline to hear. Vivian appeared moments later. She didn't scream. That was worse. She walked toward me slowly, smile locked in place, eyes cold and calculating. "You're sabotaging private events," she said softly. "That's interference. I can have you arrested." I leaned in just enough for her to hear me over the water. "Every guest here is a witness," I said. "And every dollar you take is another felony." That smile cracked. That night, something even better happened. My phone buzzed with a blocked number. A man's voice. Nervous. Controlled. "This is Mark. I handle compliance for Sterling Wellness. Off the record, you need to know Vivian never disclosed federal water protections to the board." There it was. Internal fracture. Mark emailed me documents within minutes. Investor decks promising. Unrestricted lake commercialization. Revenue projections based on 3 years of exclusive events. All false. All provable. By the time I finished reading, my hands were steady. Vivian wasn't just trespassing anymore. She was committing securities fraud. The hearing wasn't the battlefield. It was bait. And in 7 days, when her investors arrived for a showcase weekend, I was going to hand them the truth, wrapped in evidence they couldn't ignore. Because nothing scares entitled power more than exposure. And the lake was about to reflect a very ugly reality. The showcase weekend arrived dressed like a fantasy. Private chefs. Valet parking on land that still legally belonged to me. Linen tents flapping in the breeze like surrender flags that didn't know they were already defeated. Vivian had gone all in, because people like her always do when they think they're untouchable. I parked my truck a mile up the access road and walked the rest. Old habit. Quiet. Observant. From the ridge, the view was obscene. The half-finished mansion gleamed in the sun, all glass and arrogance, perched above Crystal Lake like it owned the horizon. Boats ferried guests back and forth from the dock, my dock, each wake slicing through water Hank had protected like a living thing. But something was off. The crowd was smaller than expected. Nervous energy buzzed where champagne confidence should have been. Conversation stopped when people noticed the drones overhead, mine, this time, flying legally, permits filed, logs active. That was intentional. I wanted them looking up. At noon sharp, a black Escalade pulled in. Out stepped men and women in tailored suits, not swimwear. Clipboards. Tablets. Neutral expressions. Not investors. Regulators. DQ. Fish and wildlife. and one badge that made my pulse jump: EPA. Someone had taken my bait. Vivian spotted them seconds later. I watched her posture change from host to predator. She intercepted the group with a rehearsed smile, arms open like this was all part of the show. From where I stood, I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The body language told the story. Papers exchanged. Frowns. A long pause. Then one of the agents turned and looked straight up at my drone. I lowered it slowly, deliberately, and stepped into the open. Vivian saw me. Her face drained of color so fast it was almost impressive. "What is this?" she snapped, marching toward me. "You're trespassing during a private event." I didn't raise my voice. "I'm the landowner," I said. "And you're operating a commercial enterprise on a federally protected lake." That's when the guests started listening. Phones came out. Conversations hushed. Someone whispered, "Is this real?" An EPA agent stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said to Vivian, "we've received multiple reports of unpermitted construction, water contamination, and commercial exploitation of protected resources." Vivian laughed. Actually laughed. "This is harassment," she said. "I have county approval." The agent nodded once. "County approval doesn't override federal law." Silence. The kind that presses on your ears. Another agent read from a tablet. "Initial findings indicate violations of the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and fraudulent misrepresentation to investors." That word, fraudulent, hit the crowd like a dropped plate. One man in a navy blazer stepped back. "You told us this was cleared." Vivian turned on him. "It is cleared. He's lying. This is a personal vendetta." That's when I held up the binder. Not dramatically. Just enough. "Your compliance officer thought you should know the truth," I said. Mark's documents spread fast. Faster than I expected. Investors reading projections. Comparing them to what regulators were saying out loud. Watching their dream returns evaporate in real time. Someone asked for refunds. Another demanded lawyers. One woman just stared at the lake, realizing she'd paid $500 to trespass on protected land. Vivian tried to regain control. "This is absurd," she said, voice tight. "This land was abandoned. Improved. Monetized." I met her eyes. "It was protected," I said. "You just didn't think it applied to you." The EPA agent raised a hand. "Effective immediately," he said. "All construction is suspended. All commercial activity is shut down pending investigation." He turned to me. "Sir, we'll need your documentation." I handed it over. Calm. Complete. Fatal. As the agents walked away to tag equipment and photograph runoff channels, Vivian stood frozen, surrounded by the very people she'd promised easy profit. And for the first time since I'd met her, she looked small. But this wasn't over. Because what she didn't know yet, what no one there knew yet, was that the most expensive part of this story wasn't the fines. It was what happens when courts get involved. And that bill was about to come due. Court doesn't feel like justice at first. It feels like paperwork. Fluorescent lights. Wood benches worn smooth by decades of disappointment. No drama, just time, and money, and pressure designed to break the unprepared. Vivian arrived with 3 attorneys. I arrived with 1. But I also arrived with Hank. Not physically, but his work was everywhere. The judge, an older woman with steel-gray hair and zero patience for theatrics, started with a simple question: who owns the lake? Vivian's lead attorney stood first. Confident. Polished. He spoke about improvements, abandoned land, and economic revitalization. He presented the fraudulent survey like it was gospel, waving it with the ease of someone who'd never been challenged before. Then it was my turn. I didn't start with emotion. I started with dates. 1987, VA backland purchase. 1992, federal water classification filed. 2004, conservation easement renewed. 2011 Clean Water Act Trigger Notice acknowledged by the state. 2019 Boundary reaffirmation with GPS coordinates verified. Each document hit the clerk's desk with a soft thud that echoed louder than any argument. Vivian shifted in her seat. Her attorneys tried to interrupt. The judge shut them down without looking up. Then came the photos. Aerial shots of sediment bleeding into the lake. Time-lapse videos showing shoreline collapse where oak roots had once held soil together. Screenshots of investor decks promising exclusive lake rights. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Hayes," she said, "were your investors informed that the lake was federally protected?" Vivian's attorney answered for her. "That information was under review." The judge's eyebrow rose a fraction. "And were guests charged to access this lake?" Silence. I slid the screenshot across the table. $500 per person, I said. Documented. The courtroom shifted. That's when the county tried to save face. They claimed ignorance. Blamed clerical errors. Suggested mediation. The judge wasn't interested. "This court will not legitimize fraud through compromise," she said. Then came the part Vivian didn't expect. Damages. Environmental remediation costs. Illegal profit disgorgement. Civil penalties for misrepresentation. Attorney fees. Loss of future commercial use rights. The numbers stacked fast. By the time the judge finished reading, the total sat just over $3.2 million. Vivian's face went slack. Not angry. Empty. But the final blow wasn't the money. It was the injunction. All construction removed. Shoreline restored to original condition. No future commercial activity on or near Crystal Lake, ever. She didn't just lose the case. She lost the land. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her. Inside, the judge turned to me. "Your great-uncle did remarkable work preserving this place," she said. "This court intends to honor that." I nodded, throat tight. Vivian brushed past me on the way out. She didn't threaten me. Didn't insult me. She just whispered, "You could have made millions." I watched her walk away. "I already have," I said quietly. But the story didn't end at the courthouse steps. Because what happened next surprised even me. The lake didn't just survive. It became something bigger. Something Hank would have smiled at. Winning the case didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like standing in the quiet after a storm, ears ringing, wondering what was left standing. Crystal Lake was scarred. Not ruined, but wounded. Muddy runoff stained the shoreline where oak roots had been ripped out. Concrete chunks still sat half-buried like bones from a bad memory. The mansion loomed empty, a hollow monument to arrogance, its infinity pool cracked and drained by court order. Vivian was gone. Her attorneys stopped returning calls. The Range Rover disappeared. The workers vanished overnight, leaving behind silence so deep it felt heavy. That's when the HOA showed up. Not with threats this time. With fear. 3 board members drove out together in a rented SUV. No luxury cars. No designer boots. Just middle-aged people realizing the ground under their power had shifted. They stood by the dock, my dock, hands clasped, voices careful. They didn't apologize. They negotiated. They claimed they'd been misled. That Vivian had promised shared access. That dues had already been spent. That homeowners were angry, panicking, because without lake access, property values were crashing. I listened. Then I told them the truth. "There is no HOA authority here," I said. "Never was." They flinched. I explained how Hank had structured the land. How the lake wasn't just private, it was protected. How any access had always been by permission, not right. And how charging money for it crossed from civil theft into federal violation. One of them swallowed hard. "What do you want?" he asked. That question carried more weight than any courtroom sentence. I could have locked the gates. Pressed charges. Let them drown in lawsuits and regret. Instead, I did what Hank would have done. I offer terms. No fees. Ever. No exclusivity. No development. No HOA involvement. Access would be seasonal. Limited. Community-based. Anyone caught charging for it again would lose access permanently. And one more thing. The mansion? It was to be dismantled. Not sold. Not repurposed. Removed. Brick by brick. The HOA board stared at me like I'd lost my mind. But the alternative was worse. Weeks later, excavators returned, not to build, but to undo. Walls came down. The helipad vanished. Concrete was hauled away. Native trees were replanted under state supervision. The lake breathed again. And something unexpected happened. Neighbors started helping. Not the loud ones. Not the ones who'd supported Vivian. The quiet ones. The families who'd lived there for decades. The retirees. The kids who remembered fishing before wristbands and fees. They brought seedlings. Tools. Food. One man told me he'd paid HOA dues for 12 years thinking he was buying access for his grandkids. I didn't know it was yours, he said. I'm sorry. I told him it wasn't about ownership. It was about trust. By fall, Crystal Lake looked like itself again. Clear. Cold. Honest. I scattered Hank's ashes at dawn, just like he'd asked. No speech. No audience. Just the water and the loons returning. That night, something else changed. The county announced a formal investigation. Into the HOA. Into zoning approvals. Into the sheriff's office. Turns out tennis partners don't protect you when the spotlight turns white-hot. Charges followed. Resignations. Settlements. The HOA dissolved within 6 months. But here's the twist no one expected. The land didn't become private. It became permanent. I worked with the state to turn Crystal Lake into a conservation trust, publicly protected, privately stewarded. No development. No profit. Just access with respect. People still ask if I regret not cashing in. I don't. Because money fades. But legacy doesn't. And the final chapter? It wasn't written by lawyers or judges. It was written by the water. Still. Unbothered. Waiting. People think justice is loud. They imagine gavel slams, villains screaming, winners celebrating on courthouse steps. Real justice is quieter than that. It sounds like water lapping against a dock at sunrise. It smells like pine needles after rain. Months after the HOA dissolved, Crystal Lake settled into a new rhythm. No wristbands. No fees. No luxury guests treating it like a backdrop for selfies. Just locals again. Kids learning to cast lines. Old-timers sitting on overturned buckets, telling the same stories they've told for 40 years. The mansion was gone. Where it once stood, there was a meadow now. Native grasses. Saplings protected by wire cages. A small plaque near the shoreline, no name, no ego, just a sentence. This land is not owned. It is borrowed. I kept Hank's fishing lodge exactly as it was. The creaky floorboards. The hand-cut beams. The porch where he drank coffee every morning at 6, watching deer step out of the trees like ghosts. I didn't modernize it. Didn't improve it. Some things don't need upgrading. Word spread. Not as a scandal, but as a warning. Developers stopped calling. So did consultants and opportunity partners. County offices suddenly returned emails fast. Very fast. The sheriff retired early. A few former HOA board members tried to reinvent themselves. New neighborhoods. New titles. Same energy. But people remembered. That's the thing about entitlement. It relies on silence. Once someone stands up, the spell breaks. I still work logistics, remotely now. Still drive an old truck. Still live simply. The land doesn't make me rich, but it gives me something better. Peace. Sometimes visitors ask if they can swim. I tell them yes. I ask them to respect it. They always do. On quiet evenings, when the lake is glass and the sky turns copper, I think about Hank. About how everyone thought he was crazy for choosing trees over money, water over status. Turns out he was just early. This wasn't a story about an HOA, or a mansion, or even a lawsuit. It was about remembering that not everything valuable should be sold, and not everything powerful wears a suit. If you've ever been told to move aside by someone who thought money made them untouchable, this story is for you. And if you ever inherit something sacred, protect it. Because the lake doesn't need an owner. It needs a guardian.